The Starside Prophecy by Tirri. Read by the author. Chapter 23. Soft Bed, Hard Knocks. When my mum left, I stood still looking at where her car had been parked. I then walked back inside. Becky ruffled the top of my head and showed me my new bedroom. She had put a small vase of fresh flowers on the dresser, and she asked me whether I liked tulips. I told her I did, and she told me that John had grown them in his greenhouse. My new bed was soft and big, bigger than any bed I'd slept in, and this cheered me up. The feather quilt was thick and warm, and I had 4 feather pillows. I unpacked my belongings into the chest of drawers and went back downstairs to begin my new life. The first month of living with Becky and her getting more aloof by the day husband went well. John tended to his vegetable garden and did the Times crossword a lot. He disapproved of me smoking, but Becky overruled him, as she did on everything, saying, "I would rather Sarah smokes in front of me than behind my back." I was allowed to drink wine with Sunday lunch too, but I didn't care for the taste of alcohol much. I collected the eggs from the chicken coop behind the cottage every morning and found this job very soothing. During the second month of living with Becky, she told me that she knew a lady whose daughter's rabbit had just birthed a litter and asked me if I would like one. We ended up bringing 4 of them home. Becky couldn't wait to tell John, who just said, "4?" I named my new rabbits Harvey, Digger, Dylan and Dame. And one morning a few weeks later, when I went out the back to feed them, Dame, a magnificent French lop, was missing. I surmised she had escaped to the woods behind the house, and I thought I would never see her again. I was very upset. Dame came back a week later like nothing had happened, and I was so happy. 7 weeks after that she gave birth to a litter. The father must have been some wild rogue, perhaps a hare that she had met on her travels, because her offspring looked really strange. Becky thought this was hilarious, and a big story was built around it. Anything that was out of whack seemed to move her. I rode my bike to school and back every day, a 6-mile hilly round trip. I also had a lot of cleaning to do when I got home. I became very fit and very slim without noticing. My skin was glowing and I had started my periods, which made me very happy. Most of the girls at school had started their periods when they were 11 or 12. I was 14 and glad to discover there was nothing wrong with me. My breasts began to grow too. I had been a child living in an adult world, and now I felt I was an adult living in an adult world, which made me feel more adept at dealing with the adults around me, who had seemingly forgotten that adults acting like adults might be something children actually need. As I came to know Becky, I realised she had a penchant for drama unlike anyone I'd known. My mum's life had many dramatic pendulum swings to it, but she did not live for drama the way Becky did. Drama for my mum was more of an unfortunate byproduct of life. For Becky, creating drama was her life goal, and therefore a major preoccupation. She would create the kind of drama that most people considered shameless, if not indecent. I now realise why Becky had so readily agreed to a stranger living with her. Fostering an errant teenager was one of the most dramatic things she had ever done, and it made for a great story. I was the new and shocking addition to her life. It wasn't me she had wanted so much as the shocking part. If a reporter had wanted to print the story in the local newspaper, Becky would have been delighted if the headline had read, "Troubled teenage girl saved from the clutches of her wicked mother and psychotic stepfather by Becky, direct descendant of William Wilberforce, advocate for orphans and wayward juveniles." Becky had told everyone about me, including and especially her parents, who were shocked at how quickly and scantily the so-called adoption had taken place. Shock was Becky's favourite reaction. She was only ever satisfied when whatever drama taking place had swallowed everyone whole. More was better in her world. And even when relaying the details of day-to-day events, she exaggerated every detail. On slow days, she would outright lie. Something could always be stirred up in her imagination and passed off as a real-life happening, especially with enough whiskey in her system. Because Becky had work-related responsibilities to take care of during the week, there wasn't much time for alcohol, but all that changed at 6 p.m. on Friday evenings. Becky drank a lot on the weekends. She could handle it quite well, but this was when her storytelling really came alive. Most people's response to Becky's storytelling was a wide-open mouth, the proverbial drop jaw. She loved that, and I loved it too. Becky could be a bit hazy over her morning cup of tea about what she had said the night before, but at least she had enough self-awareness to realise she might have overdone it. Now it was the time for playing down of events, just so the dreary facts that were all that was left. Living with Becky was a surreal but a uniquely stimulating period in my life. I never knew what to expect, or what Becky would think of next, and I enjoyed everyone's reaction to her as much as she did. It was harmless, but it was somehow sad. John didn't know what to make of any of it. He accepted the fact that I was just a shocking new addition and kept his distance lest the weirdness distract him from completing the Times crossword. It was 9 a.m. one Sunday morning when I walked into the kitchen in my pyjamas, yawning. Becky was brewing some tea and said, "Change into something pretty, we're going to Doddenall's." She sounded so chirpy. I didn't know where or what Doddenall's was, but Becky seemed enthusiastic and so did I. Becky drove the car while John silently stared out of the passenger window. Doddenall's, an hour's drive away in Devon's neighbouring county of Somerset, was the name of the cottage that Becky's parents lived in. Tim, Becky's younger brother, lived there too. Doddenall's was a peaceful domestic place perched high on a hill, and everything revolved around family life, of which I was now seemingly a part. I didn't want to leave that night, but I didn't tell Becky that. I was very grateful to her and would not have said anything to upset her. I instantly connected with both her parents and felt very relaxed around them. They seemed so familiar. I was asked to call them Auntie Joan and Uncle Jim. My new relatives, with the surname of Elks, treated me as if I was their eldest granddaughter. We visited my new aunt and uncle a lot, and I got to know Tim, Becky's younger brother, quite well. Tim was younger than Becky by 5 years and lived at Doddenall's because he had to. I was told that he had been starved of oxygen at birth. This was the official story, but when I looked at him, the facts did not add up. Tim did not look like the type of person that society considered normal. His features and his disproportional frame were all wrong. His shoulders sloped excessively, and his legs were very short, and he had very narrow fingers. Tim couldn't speak or grunt any more than 30 or so words, let alone read or write, despite the best tutors having been employed. But the more I observed him, the more I came to the conclusion that he understood way more than anyone gave him credit for. He had just had no means of expression. In all imaginable ways, people responded to Tim like he was a 7-year-old child. This was difficult for Tim to deal with, and it was difficult for me to watch. Becky had already told me that although Tim had a mental age of 7, he had the sex drive of a grown man, and she schooled me on what to do if Tim made a pass at me. "Just wag your finger in his face and say, 'No, Tim,' very firmly." This was good advice and timely. One of the first things Tim did was make an advance. He never tried it again, presumably because I was very firm. Tim's ability, or I suspected aspiration, to use sign language to communicate was limited. Instead, he would articulate a single word when attempting to express the totality of what was on his mind. If he pointed to the sky and spoke the word up, this could mean something like, "I would like to go on a holiday to Spain with someone that can take me shopping. I want lots of money. I would like to stay in a hotel where there is a swimming pool and lots of people to watch, especially girls in bikinis. I'd like to watch movies in my bed. Can you make this happen exactly the way I want it to happen? I would like a wheelchair when I need it because my legs hurt when I walk." From one guttural-sounding word, and as far as I was concerned, a belligerently sparing use of sign language, Tim exhausted everyone trying to interpret for him. Guessing what Tim was thinking was the only game in town. I think Tim approved of this because he felt he was owed. Tim was very angry and very frustrated and felt entitled to compensation in every area he could find it. Because of this, Tim had grown into an extremely self-centred man, and this was encouraged by his parents. I understood. To be born with so many disadvantages, but with enough functioning consciousness to be aware of them, must have been torture. Sparing Tim of difficulty by making every effort to become a vehicle for his expression was something both his parents were willing to do, and I admired them for that. Tim had some autonomy, but no real freedom, and he could not communicate, but he actually had quite a lot to be grateful for, especially when compared to all the starving Ethiopian children paraded on the BBC News every night. Tim had a loving family, attention, lots of money to spend, a trust fund, security, friends, and genuine concern from a lot of people who genuinely cared, but none of this meant anything to him. He would never have the things that most normal men had, and I am certain he knew it. Tim was the youngest of 5 children, a change-of-life baby, and his older siblings, all girls, were expected to put Tim first at all times. So was I. This took its toll on his relationship with his sisters, who might have otherwise idolised him. They didn't. His sisters had to deal with their resentment and then their guilt, all the while ensuring their smiles were genuine. At this time in my young life, I noticed that I was making observations about the character and nature of those around me with ease, observations others did not seem to make at all. Tim seemed like the final proof of this. I thought about this a lot for a while, and I realised that I had simply been watching others in a way that others were not. My parents had not shielded me from life in the least. I had not yet realised, however, that I had no conscious recognition of my own states of mind. This I was not even sufficiently aware of to ponder. I had been living with Becky and John for several whirlwind and happy months when things took a steep downturn. Uncle Jim and Auntie Joan and Tim had come to visit. Becky had arranged for us all to meet at a nearby country pub because they served steak and kidney pie, that was Auntie Joan's favourite, and lemon meringue pie, which was Tim's favourite. This was when Becky sprang the news on them, and me, that she was 3 months pregnant with her first child. John didn't say much at all, but Becky was delighted. I was horrified. I knew instantly that this would be the demise of my new life with her. In the weeks that ensued, Becky began nesting and my presence quickly became an intrusion. Becky was responsible for someone she no longer wanted to be responsible for. She had no legal obligation to take care of me, and now it appeared not an ethical one either. I understood because I had figured her out early on. Her motive for adopting me had very little to do with me, and the baby growing inside her now signified a whole new drama was up for grabs. Creating a new drama to end an old one was an obvious choice for her, and so I held my breath for what would come next. Nevertheless, I was dismayed because my life was on the verge of changing again. It didn't take long for our bond to break, and many arguments ensued. Becky was instigating drama and I was angry. John couldn't stand the tension and went for endless solitary walks, and I spent a lot of time in my bed, hiding from a life that was once again changing form. I had just turned 15. Late one Sunday night, everything came to a quick and unexpected head. Becky and I had gotten into another explosive argument, an inconsequential power struggle of some sort, when the phone rang. This was unusual because it was past 9. Without knowing who it was on the line, Becky grabbed the phone on the 3rd ring. It was her father. I refused to leave the room and listened with silent umbrage as she told Uncle Jim how difficult I was and how unmanageable I had become. But to my surprise, the conversation ended abruptly. Becky hung up the phone and spun around, hissing, "My dad is coming to get you. Go and pack your things." She was furious and red-faced, and I quickly backed out of the room. She had not gotten the reaction from her father she had hoped for. Ironically, his actions were to rescue me from her. I ran upstairs to pack my stuff. It didn't take long, and I remained in my room and kept my eyes on the window. I was nervous. I had only had a pleasant familiarity with Jim and Joan Elks, but really knew nothing much about them. This made me feel insecure, but something felt right about this next scene change in my life. I didn't know what. Besides, my choices were limited. I certainly couldn't go back to my mum, and my dad was still trapped in a marriage he was still trying to extricate himself from. I saw headlights sweep across the front lawn and said goodbye to my bed before carrying my belongings downstairs. Becky's dad hadn't moved from the doorway, and as I reached the bottom stair he looked me directly in the eye and smiled warmly and sincerely. It was as if we were somehow long-lost friends, and he was delighted that we had reunited. Up until that point, I felt that I might have just been some misfit he had the begrudging obligation to take on because his wild child daughter had implicated him in another one of her legendary messes. But something about Uncle Jim's countenance assured me that the situation we were both in was far more run-of-the-mill than a surface appraiser would have attested to. It almost felt normal, whatever that meant. Little was said between Becky and her dad, and sadly nothing was said between Becky and I. I felt bad about this because Becky and her dad had been close, and now it was as if he was closer to me. I climbed into the passenger seat of a dark green Audi and belted myself in. Uncle Jim put the car in gear, and I was soon heading down the A303 for another new life with a retired couple I had only known for a short time. I turned to look out of the side window so Uncle Jim wouldn't notice my tears. 30 minutes or so of silence followed. Uncle Jim had 4 daughters, and so perhaps he was used to tears and recognised I didn't want to be comforted or questioned. I was very tired emotionally, but when I had cried a sufficient number of tears, I began to feel more stable. The blend of exhaustion and sorrow contributed to that. As we left Devon and entered Somerset, a picture of my brother entered my mind's eye. I hadn't seen that much of him, mostly at school. We cared for each other, but had both become self-absorbed as we resided in survival mode. My brother still had to endure Roy, and I wondered whether things were worse for him. I had not seen that much of my mother either. She was too busy living the high life, but the anger I had felt towards her when she had first dropped me off at Becky's was waning. My anger would spike unexpectedly from time to time, but I felt sorry for her more than anything. I missed her. I missed my dad. I missed my brother, and now I would miss my rabbits. I looked at Jim Elks and he smiled at me. My face was blotchy, but he didn't comment. He smelled of pipe tobacco. I thought about his wife. I liked Joan and the cosy old cottage they lived in very much. My mother would have liked it too. I would phone her tomorrow to let her know where I was. It was a Sunday night and the old green Audi heading east on the A303 was approaching the Somerset border. Through the eye, Mckeisseldeck watched the dark-haired, green-eyed girl sitting in the front seat. She was pensive and her face was blotchy from weeping, but the man at the wheel was stoic and smiling. "Good," said Mckeisseldeck to himself. "All is on course."